Hi, my name is Justin Leung. I am an Asian man in my late 20s wearing a tan shirt with a photo of Darlingtonia, californica in the center. Behind me is a progressive rainbow flag and a map of the Monterey Bay. Today I will be talking about local adaptations for ecological restoration, a case study with Eschscholzia californica. Before we get more into the research, I just want to do some acknowledgements, starting with the land acknowledgement to say that the land on which I did this research and on which I'm speaking today is the unceded territory of the Aswaswa-speaking Yuwipi tribe. Today, the modern Amamusin tribal band are currently working towards healing from historical trauma and working towards traditional stewardship of these lands. I also want to thank my numerous student interns and volunteers that assisted with experimental setup, data collection, and data processing. I want to thank the greenhouse staff and also the city staff that helped me set up my experiment. So as we continue to progress through time, it's likely that we'll continue to lose habitats and ecosystems due to land use change and because of climate change. And because of that, we may need to undertake ecological restoration to ensure the persistence of these habitats. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And common restoration practices often include replanting or sowing native species, although there are maybe other practices that can be employed. So within restoration, there's a really big debate about how to source our plants and whether or not locally sourced plants benefit from local adaptations. Local adaptations are when a population of a species develops unique traits that allows them to survive better in its local environment compared to non-local seed sources. But the question is, are local plants always best for restoration, given that recent reviews found that 46% of the almost 1,000 plant populations studied exhibited adaptations, which is less than commonly thought, because many in restoration often think that local adaptations are widespread and common for all species. And it is true that oftentimes we do see differences in morphology, as you can see on the 3 different images of Eschscholzia californica here, sourced from different locations. But past studies have also shown that morphological differences doesn't always relate to reproductive output. So to further explore how local adaptations may play a role in California grassland restoration, I selected a model organism, Eschscholzia californica, which is known to have morphological variation and is commonly used for restoration across the state. And I asked these 2 questions. Do Eschscholzia californica populations locally sourced have greater reproductive output locally compared to non-locally sourced populations? And are plants sourced from coastal regions adapted for coastal fog, which would be exhibited through increased seed output? So to better understand whether or not the California poppy, Eschscholzia californica, exhibits local adaptations, I selected seeds from 8 different populations across this 1,300-kilometer north-south gradient from Humboldt, California to Ensenada, Mexico. And this gradient captures wide variation in mean annual precipitation and mean annual temperature. So to determine whether or not Eschscholzia californica has or exhibits local adaptations, I combined field and greenhouse methods to first test in the field whether or not using locally sourced seeds benefits reproductive output in a 2-site reciprocal transplant, also known as a common garden, located in Santa Cruz, California. I then also combined this method with a greenhouse study where I used experimental fog manipulations where plants were put into a fog chamber overnight and exposed to fog for 8 hours daily for a month. And then I measured various responses such as leaf traits and reproductive output and photosynthetic rates. Today, I will only be talking about results from the first year of the Common Garden, the greenhouse study, and talking mostly about leaf traits and reproductive output. And I won't be discussing photosynthetic rates. So In the field, from the first year results, we found that seed output and leaf traits vary by locality, but local populations did not necessarily produce more seeds than non-local sources. On the first figure on the left, we have a box plot. On the y-axis is the seed production at a plot level, which was determined as the average seed production of a particular locality multiplied by the number of seeding plants. On the x-axis is the source locality organized from north to south. We found that there was a sourcing effect for seed production at the plot level. And particularly, we see that Humboldt, Yolo, and Mexico produced less seeds, and Santa Cruz, which is the local seed and the local population being grown in the garden, does produce more seeds than those three populations, but produces statistically similar seeds to the other populations, Colusa, Sonoma, Santa Barbara, and Orange, which indicates that it may not have local adaptations in terms of reproduction. We also do see that there's a sourcing effect in leaf morphology where there is wide variation in leaf area depending on where the plant is sourced from. In the greenhouse, using a subset of the 5 populations we used in the field, we also found that coastal versus interior sourcing and fog treatments resulted in distinct morphology as exhibited through above and below ground biomass and growth, but not necessarily seed production. On the figures here on the y-axis, respectively, are the seed production, above ground biomass in grams, and below ground biomass. On the x-axis is whether or not the plants were coastal plants or sourced from coastal locations or sourced from interior locations that do not normally experience fog. The California coast is a little special because every summer it experiences summertime fog for 40 to 80% of its days. And past studies have shown that summertime fog can also contribute to plant water use. Within the figures, the box plots, the green boxes, the dark green boxes are the controls, the plants that are not fogged, and the light pale blue is the fog treatment and the plants that were fogged. And just a reminder, a fog treatment means the plants were put into a fog chamber and they were done so for 30 straight days, and they were fogged for 8 hours every night and then removed and kept in normal conditions during the day. We found that there was no effect of the fog treatment or sourcing on seed pod production. However, we did find that there was an effect of fog on above ground biomass, and oftentimes fog resulted in lower biomass above ground. And we also found a sourcing effect, a seed locality sourcing effect on below ground biomass, where interior sites often had lower below ground biomass compared to coastal sites. So we just covered a lot of information. So what does that all mean in entirety? Well, both the field and greenhouse experiments showed that sourcing affected plant growth and morphology as exhibited through changes in the plant biomass, both above and below ground, and differences in leaf traits, like leaf area. However, we found that morphological differences were not necessarily always related to reproductive output, and differences that were exhibited between different source localities were often only related to morphology and not necessarily related to seed production. And this may indicate that although these plants do have distinct morphology, they're not necessarily locally adapted if we're strictly thinking about fitness and seed output. And because of that, restoration projects in the future may benefit from using genetic mixtures of multiple populations to help improve resiliency for climate change. For example, there may be traits latent within a different population that could help a population that is not used to warm conditions or drought survive those conditions in the future. And so there'll need to be further work in the future to think a little bit more about how to balance these different factors. It's also really important, as demonstrated in these 2 studies, that morphology and reproductive output in terms of local adaptations don't always have similar responses. And just because we observe that they have different morphology, it doesn't necessarily mean they have greater seed output, and doesn't mean they will necessarily sustain the population better than non-local sources. With that, I want to thank you all for attending my talk, and I welcome any questions anyone may have either now or later on. You can reach me also through my email at jluong4@ucsc.edu. You can also find me on Twitter at Justin C. Loam. And if you want to find out more about my work, you can check out my personal website at justinloam.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of your LGBT Steminar experience. Thank you.